My name is Harrison Estes. It is April 16th, and this is my persuasive speech. Video games are an extremely prominent aspect of a typical adolescent's life in today's society. There are many variations of video games in the gaming market. They range from simple and educational to realistic and violent. Violent video games such as games with shooting and killing have been said to cause a negative effect on the developing mind of a teenager. Although the more graphic and violent video games have an age requirement for purchasing, many underage adolescents somehow manage to get their hands on the games. Explicit video games may lead to an increase in aggression and violent behaviors, shootings in school systems, and promotion of gun violence. There is a link between violent video games and aggression in the users of the games. According to the article, Violent Video Games Cause Aggression in Children and Should Be Regulated by Stephen Gruhl, violent video games lead to aggressive behaviors because they reward the users for violent behaviors committed in the game. In turn, this reward increases violent and aggressive behaviors. In March of 2010, many studies were conducted to see if violent video games did lead to aggression and violent behaviors. The results from the experiments do not prove that they caused these behaviors. However, it suggests that participating in violent video games increases vicious and hostile thoughts. Extended play of violent video games decreases the activity in the frontal cortex of the brain that is affiliated with self-control and discipline. When there is a decrease in self-control and discipline, a person is more susceptible to acting violently and aggressive. 2 to 3 hours of exposure to violent video games raise adrenaline levels that have also been said to lead to aggressiveness. According to the article, violent video games do promote teen aggression and violence. Many tests have been run on the brains of users participating in the violent video games. However, the meanings of the brain's functional changes are unknown. Dr. Wang said that there is evidence of changes in the brain when subjected to violent video games. However, he said that these changes were unknown, and there is no proof that violent video games cause aggressive and violent behaviors. Until the meaning of these neurological changes can be understood, the linkage between violent video games and aggressive behaviors are not associated. Although violent video games have been said to lead to aggressive behaviors, they've also been said to an increase in shootings in school systems. This is my visual aid, which shows the link between violent video games and aggression in the users who participate in them. These images show changes in the brain after 2 weeks of video game use. From brain scans, it shows that violent video games do have an effect on the brains of the users. It has also been shown in studies that children who are subjected to violent video games are typically more aggressive and less sensitive to violence. The results show teens that played violent video games showed an increased activity in the amygdala with a decrease of activity in parts of the brain involved in self-control, inhibition, and attention. Violent video games have a negative impact on students, which leads to an increase in school system shootings. According to the article, Violent Video Games Train School Shooters by Jack Thompson, exposure to an intense material leads to an increase in school shootings. The FBI and U.S. Secret Service agree that the continuous participation in violent video games has a common factor in many school shootings. In 2004, a young boy dressed in camouflage entered his school with numerous weapons. The police searched his home to determine what sparked his threatening behaviors. They were looking for violent video games. Prior to school shootings, all had a common factor. That common factor was violent video games in which the player would shoot or kill avatars in the game. This commonality between school shootings supports the idea that the violent video games do lead to shootings in school systems. However, according to the article, Violent Video Games Do Not Create School Shooters by Henry Jenkins, federal crime statistics show that although the availability of violent video games is at an all-time high, the rate of teenage crimes is at the lowest it's been in 30 years. People that have been convicted on violent crimes appear to spend less time viewing violent media than the typical population. A report was conducted in 2001 that showed that there was a correlation between school shootings and a person's mental state, not their contact with violent media. Also, no evidence has been found that proves a relationship with violent video games and school system shootings. Violence in video games may or may not lead to an increase in gun violence. The exposure of violent video games leads to the promotion of gun violence. Stated in an article known as Popular Culture, which promotes gun violence. There is a connection between violence from video games and gun violence in that article. Studies over the years have shown that cultural and social influences promote gun violence. Gun violence is something that can be learned as a result of exposure. In 2008, a Canadian study was conducted which demonstrated a correlation between gun violence and violent video games. The percent of firearm-related crimes committed by teens were at an all-time high. The increased rate of gun violence is an effect of the violence in today's media. However, there is another side to whether or not the violence in video games promotes gun violence. According to the article, violent video games are not linked to real-world violence by Tory Meeks, it states that all violent video games are not responsible for gun violence. Although violent video games are more popular than ever, the acts of violence committed by teenagers are down. This statement refutes the idea that violent video games cause teens to commit acts of violence. Violent actions are committed by teens that have an underlying issue, such as a mental disorder. Although violent video games do express extreme scenes of violence, it does not mean that these games create violence in the real world. This means that gun violence is not promoted by the violence observed in video games. Video games are a popular source of entertainment in today's culture. Many games contain violent and graphical material. Children, teens, adults all consume the material when participating in games. It is debatable whether or not the exposure to violence in video games has a negative impact on the user. From the research done, there is a correlation between negative effects on the individuals and violence from video games. Even though correlation does not mean causation, the correlation is extremely high. There are two sides to the argument of whether or not violent video games cause aggression. Statistics and evidence lean more toward the idea that violent video games do lead to aggressive behaviors in users who participate in them. The research shows that violence from the video games leads to aggression and violent behaviors, an increase in school shootings, and the promotion of gun violence in today's society. That is my speech. Thank you.
Thank you.